Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
Good morning. So, in the
Good
last couple
morning.
of episodes, we've talked about the ends gaining habit and the means for by principle. And essential for being able to avoid the end gaining habit and follow the means for by principle is the idea of orders, which are sometimes called instructions, sometimes called directions now. So,
Yeah.
can you talk about a very general introduction? What are orders? How did FM Alexander actually use the word orders? What does he mean by it? And can you address some of the misunderstandings of what this means that came later?
Yes. Orders. Well, you can't think of the Alexander technique without this very strange concept of giving oneself instructions. Of course, at first, Alexander explained that it's the teacher that is going to start the quest. And to start the quest, the teacher will give some orders, which are verbal instructions, you will see, to the pupil, for the pupil to rehearse the orders covertly in his mind. And this is framed into this strange somatic way of teaching that Alexander all his life, all the second part from 1918 till the end, gave orders and manipulated people with his hands, touching people and moving them, moving the parts. And so this was it. My point on this is that when I finished my training as a touch teacher, so exactly in the same frame of pedagogy where I was taught to create a gesture with my hands for the pupil, and the pupil will rehearse these orders that were to be associated. So the order was, the pupil was feeling some change because he was organizing, he was, well, experiencing the organization of the parts of his own body by someone else. And at the same time, he was rehearsing orders that were not always making much sense. And he was making a sort of connection between the two. That was the training I received. It's still nowadays the modern Alexander technique pedagogy. And so when I finished, I started at one moment by chance to observe my own gestures, my own postures, if you want. I will explain later. And I suddenly realized that in the context that is very clear of this technique, the context is that when you start having lesson, you discover that you have wrong habits. You have wrong habits of posture. You have wrong habit of movement. You have wrong habits of reaction. That was my case. And you're supposed to train and discover this technique and even to apply this technique to yourself. And at the end of the process, you are promised that everything will be fine and that you will command new habits which are free of the wrong gesture, the wrong posture, and the wrong reactions. When I started to, in fact, observe myself on video, recording workshops where I was teaching, wow, I was struck by the fact that in the context of reeducation, of the use of the anatomical structure, this strange sentence means that you are capable of deciding which movement you want of which parts and which movement you don't want to see, so that the gesture creates a posture that is according to the end, which is the widening, lengthening of the mechanism of the torso. I found out that I had failed, or my training had failed. That looking at myself, it was absolutely clear that the defects or peculiarities that Alexander was always pointing to regarding the physical presence were still there. 3 years training course, a lot of money invested, and whoa, I could only see that there was something amiss, that this idea of gaining freedom was not there. Oh, certainly I felt completely differently. I felt nice and light, but the feeling and the reality were not well working together. One must be right. If you feel light, why is it that you're arching the back? Why is it that you're pulling one shoulder further down than the other? How is it that you look really distorted on screen? So I started to believe what I saw instead of believing what I feel. So there are ways to understand what Alexander means by giving orders, projecting orders. And what I'm going to explain here is my views, of course, on the subject. And this view has been informed by reading and rereading Alexander. And then not only reading what he's talking about, but also, well, of course, criticizing what's necessary, and a lot of testing. It's a technique of experiment. The Alexander technique is a technique of experiment. So I started to use the technique of experiment to, in fact, start to understand a bit better what Alexander was talking about. So this is the introduction.
And for people watching that don't know this, you also translated all of F.M. Alexander's books from English into French.
Well, yes, that was the first phase of the study. I translated the 4 books into French, but a much bigger work was awaiting me. It was to translate the books into English. By that I mean that most of the time, the understanding of the book is very shallow. People just have this fantastic mind of data, of ideas, but it's phrased in a difficult way, and it's very difficult to get an understanding without really well, immersing yourself and making connection inside the books. When he's talking about something, where is he talking about the same thing? And then collecting all these things and trying to make an overview and trying to analyze then what could be the definition of the words that we are missing, because there are words used in the books. And so, for example, and gaining, means whereby, primary control, all these things, conscious control also, are words. And we tend to have preconceived ideas about what they mean. I found that it was absolutely necessary to make that correlation system and trying to find all the instances where one set of words would appear and try to, well, outguess what Alexander was meaning, because Alexander is not precise in his definition. He very, very seldom give definitions. So you have to work, and also you have to. What is fantastic in this system is that we are talking about a concrete end. We are talking about what we call the readjustment of the anatomical structure, meaning that the individual should be capable of deciding which movements he wants to produce, well, which coordinated movement he wants to produce, that is movement that is going to give consent to at the same time, and therefore obtain an end. That's the idea. So, okay, let's start from the beginning. We are going to start very slowly with this. We are projecting ourselves in a situation where there is a pupil that has come to see me because he thinks that I can help him take control of his way of using the different parts of the organism. That's how I present my lessons. The person wants to learn how by herself change the way the person moves the different parts. That is important to understand because the person will live with herself all the time, while she will spend with me something like 1 hour a week or 1 hour every month. So it's absolutely unbelievable to imagine that the teacher, that is me, will be capable of making such a change in this 1 hour so that the old habits of the person that are responsible for the disorders are going to evaporate for the next week or for the next month. It's impossible. So in this technique, there is this fundamental idea that we want to give command to the other. We want to give the control to the pupil. The pupil has to learn a technique to work with himself, and working with himself will mean experimenting with new movements, experimenting with new coordinated actions, which means that the person will have to decide to, in fact, start a number of movements at the same time, which is what we call coordination. So giving the power to the pupil is the idea. I was attracted to Alexander for this very reason to start with. And in fact, it didn't work like this, really. I was engaged in the technique, and I followed the way of the modern Alexander technique without really finding what I wanted. Because in the modern Alexander technique, the teacher has got a special gift of feeling. He can feel things you can't, and he knows things you don't. And the only thing you're told is, wait, one day you will have the same thing. To me, it was not anywhere near this idea of taking command. I wanted to take command of my habits. I didn't want someone else to take commands of my habits, because I really saw from the start that it was not possible to imagine that it could work. So when we start with this idea, and Alexander is very clear. In Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual, he says, it's a second book, that's 1923, and he say, the teacher, during the process of the lesson, will then renew the request to the pupil to give the orders, and with his hands will command for him the actual performance of the movement, of which these orders are the counterpart. Well, I choose this first quote because there are a few things here. We see that, well, Alexander, the teacher, is requesting the pupil to give the orders. So Alexander does not define here what these orders are, and we will find that there is a big problem with this. He just say that his technique is evolving around this capacity of the pupil to give himself orders. You must understand that if you accept the idea of giving yourself one order, this is just a start, because there is a phase that is awaiting you, is that at one moment you must realize that you will need to obey. You will need to learn how to obey, and what it is to obey orders that are given in series. Not one order, do this, and then after that, do that. No, give yourself a few orders. Don't do anything about it, because if you do, you're going to do one order after the other. It's not what we want. We want to rehearse the order one after the other. But the idea is to combine these now intentions. We say intentions because it's something that is not yet in fact, realized. It's not yet taken to the stage where you perform the orders. It's a stage giving orders that is before action. So you give yourself orders. So what it means is that you must learn to give yourself an order and not react in any way. It's a strange thing, but this opens the way for a coordination of orders, which means in your mind, you're going to tell yourself, I want to define one action and not do anything about it, just define it. It's an intention that I'm creating. I want this action to, in fact, be projected. And I will think another order, which is another intention of action, and a strange alchemy of the higher cognitive system of human beings is that we can start to, in fact, decide, make decisions of action that are in numbers. We can decide to move, for example, at the same time, the 3 different parts of the torso and the arm. Well, another stage is to do the projection. So then you are doing 3 action or 4 action at the same time, and you want to control whether what you have projected, which is the coordinated intentions all together, whether they have been translated in practice or not, because we are not used to, in fact, creating an actual performance of movement that is so much reason. Most of the time when we perform a gesture, 99% of it is just according to what we feel, subconscious. We don't think of these parts. So that's the first thing. Alexander is clearly stating that this technique is, in fact, revolving around this concept that is not a somatic concept. We are not asking the person to feel something, as it looks like when you look at a modern Alexander technique touch lesson. It's as if the orders should be associated with the feeling produced by the teacher. That is incomprehension or misconception is introduced in the second part of the sentence, because Alexander say that he gives the orders to the pupil, and with his own hands, the teacher's hands, he will command for him the actual performance of the movement. By actual performance of the movement, in this passage, Alexander is talking of a whole body movement. He's talking of a person that is standing, and then Alexander will ask the person to rehearse the movements, rehearse the orders, whatever they are, and will make the person, well, lean forward with the torso in a certain way that is different from the habitual way of the person, and go to sit. The difference that the command the teacher is going to exert on the anatomical structure of the person is easily summarized. It's all based on the capacity of making that movement of going from standing to sitting with the torso expanding. That's very simple. And in the sentence, Alexander is clearly stating that the orders the pupil is rehearsing are the counterpart of the correct performance of that gesture, that movement. In Alexander's book, there is a problem because Alexander used the same word, movement, to define 2 different things. One is, in this case, for example, the performance of the whole body movement. It's like what I call the gesture. And what I call gesture is made of movements. Made of movements means that it's made of segmental movements. And the segments are bony segments or group of bones that are moving together. In order to achieve any sort of posture, you need to move the different parts into a certain geometrical relationship. it is the geometrical relationship that makes what is the posture. So regarding posture, Alexander makes a very interesting comments in much later after writing this first quote. It's in 1949 in the St. Dunstan lecture. He was accompanied by his secretary, and she took note of everything he said during that conference. And so 1949 is the end of Alexander working life. He's going to stop in 5 years' time. This is not the start. This is not the young Alexander I'm talking about. So Alexander declares during that lecture to the public, I don't like the word posture. I don't like the word behavior. And I used them as little as possible in my books, which is true, by the way. Posture is a static condition. It is the end to be gained, not the means whereby you should gain it. The point I'm after is that I am interested in what you are doing with yourself in moving, for instance, your arm. I needed to point to that quote because Alexander here is clear. He's stating that the posture, the static condition, is the end to be gained. So when the person is going from standing to sitting, of course, there is a position in starting. There is a position at the end when you arrive on the chair. But Alexander sometimes makes no sense because he's also talking of the posture or the position when the person is in movement. He's talking of position in walking, position in running, position in going downstairs. And you see here that he's talking of the end to be gained. The relationship between the different parts that make the expansion of the torso is an end. Lengthening and widening the back is an end. The fact that the neck is free is an end. It's not a means whereby. What are the means whereby to gain the end? This is the very, very fundamental question that I asked myself, because when I finished my training course, all my teachers thought that repeating in your mind some orders that are not exactly orders, the orders that you'd never obey are not exactly orders. And repeating in your mind, I want my back to lengthen and widen, was going to do the trick someday. After 3 years of such a training, watching myself on video, it was already not happening. I have a picture of a very interesting picture where we see a somatic touch teacher working, and next to it, there is a quote by Alexander, and he's talking about his visual impressions. So you see a person that is using the hands. So Alexander's interest is what you're doing when you're using your hands, for example. Well, fine, that person is using the hands, that's fine. So we see that the person is standing and he's placing the hands on the ears of a person that is lying down in front of her. And when you look at that picture, well, in the way I was looking at myself, you're not looking at the pupil, of course, you're looking at the person that is active. The person that is active here is what we call the touch teacher. And the visual impression you get is that the upper part of the chest is really arched backward. And in order to make that statement, you have to, in fact, tell backward relative to what? Well, it's very clear. It's backward relative to the middle of the torso. So there is a protruding abdomen. Alexander used an old expression. He says the upper part of the chest held unusually high, and he says pater pigeon style. The part of pigeon style in the beginning of the last century was a form of female position of seduction. It was created with corsets, which corsets were having the lower part of the torso protrude back with a nice bottom, if you want, like a chest that is thrown forward in the middle, and the upper torso propped back, like some pigeons do. Yes, to look sexy. I think when a pigeon wants to look sexy, that's what they do. And so Alexander is pointing the finger and showing that these movements of the different parts, of the moving parts of the torso, are creating a marked lumbar curve of the spine. Very clearly, we say the person is not using herself well as a result of the stimulus to bring the hands forward to touch the head of someone. Yes, we see the protruding abdominal wall, which tell us that the lumbar, thoracolumbar junction, which is the greatest spring in the back, is totally inactive. And from that, Alexander, in fact, said that the thorax was harmfully rigid, and you don't need to place your hands on a person to feel that the thorax is harmfully rigid, because that is what is happening when you see that the position, the end, is what you see here. And so this is only a posture, this is only a position. So this is the end. No, but what is interesting is that we are supposed to be specialists of means whereby obtaining the end we want. And so when I was not looking at this person, but looking at myself doing the same thing and producing the same result, it was like a nightmare. I could see what I didn't want, and like that person, I had no means whereby. I had no idea of what could be the means, what the nature of the means whereby. That was the first problem. What is the nature of the means whereby? Are means whereby just ideas you have in your mind that are, well, with time going to impress yourself? Are these orders like a correspondence of the feeling? Because that person that you see arching the back in that way does not know she's doing that. She does not feel this. If she was feeling this, she would not do it, certainly. The thing is, with all the orders of refusing to do things that she has learned during a training, because that is a part of the Alexander technique, learning to say no, that the person has learned to say no, but apparently she's still saying yes to the movements that are producing this gesture. So orders had to be redefined. It's very important that you understand that the orders as I see them, as I will explain here, are not orders as they are seen by other people reading Alexander's books. You have to make your own mind. You have to maybe read the books and look at the sentences and make your mind to see whether it's possible that there is a misunderstanding. Well, I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm saying that there may be a misunderstanding between the two opposing factions. The modern Alexander technique says that the orders are simply orders you rehearse in your mind that are associated slowly to some physical experience, which are sensory experience produced by an expert touch teacher. That's one take on the idea behind orders. The second idea behind orders is mine. It's different. Yes, the orders are verbal instructions that are defining the means whereby the end is obtained, which is what sort of position, what sort of gesture you're producing. And these means whereby are orders of movement. They must define movement. So when Alexander says, talks about his lessons and about his impression, visual impressions, he's not talking about what he feels with his hands on the pupil. No, he's talking about his visual impressions, what he sees. Yes, we see the result, we see the end, but we don't see the means whereby, instructions. We have no idea what they are for the moment. So this is what Alexander, coming back to the start with the first book, this is what Alexander says when he has these visual impression. Now, the narrowing and arching of the back, already referred to, is exactly opposite to what is required by nature and to that which is obtained in reeducation, coordination, and readjustment. That is, the widening of the back and a more normal and extended position of the spine. Moreover, if these conditions of the back be first secured, the neck and arm will no longer be stiffened, and the other faults will be eradicated. So, Alexander has a visual observation. He takes out of that a few, well, these are not convictions. These are just a reasoning point that when you see that a person is arching the back and protruding the upper chest in the Pater Pigeon style, and when just lifting the hands to touch a pupil, well, that person is in need of reeducation. And so this idea of reeducation associated with order, what is the reeducation we are talking to? Well, the reeducation is the reeducation of the person's own system of guidance. This idea, you will hear very often that some teachers are talking about the reeducation of the sensory appreciation. It's the reeducation of the appreciation of the means necessary to perform an end, not a reeducation of what you feel. The system of guidance for Alexander can be of two kinds. It can be conscious or subconscious. What do we mean by subconscious? Very simply, a system of guidance based on what you feel. Whether what you feel is produced by yourself or what you feel is produced by an expert manipulator is the same thing. It's still a system of guidance based on feeling. And there is also the conscious guidance system. So when we mean reeducation, we want the person to go from the subconscious system of guidance, that was the original plan, toward the construction of a conscious system of guidance. And so what is a conscious system of guidance is now the question I had to ask myself. Well, the answer was surprisingly easy to find. A conscious system of guidance is a system of guidance through instructions, through verbal instructions. You don't do what you feel. You stipulate what we call the movements that are necessary to combine together in order to produce the shape you see as an end. So if you see that the upper part of the torso is back, that the middle part of the torso is forward, and that the lower part of the torso is back, so for example, you have a convex curve, a curve in which the center is in fact projected forward by the movements of the person that is, by the way, not aware she's doing all these movements at the same time. She has not had the chance to see herself on video and notice that these movements appeared like a habit every single time the person was trying to use the hands. So Alexander is not interested in the gesture. He's not interested in the fact that the posture is clearly a shortening of the back. And impairing the breathing, impairing the digestion system, impairing all the functions, because the functions in the human being depends on the space you give them to function. If you sit, for example, for hours with your torso collapsed any which way, well, you have an idea that in the long term and mid-term, you're going to suffer for it. That is what I don't like, the expression, what is required by nature. This idea that nature would require anything is very strange to me. But you can understand it by saying that if you have a mechanism with certain moving parts, well, if you prevent some part from moving, if you constrain the movement of these levers, well, you can imagine that after a very short time, the mechanism is not going to work correctly. You don't have to invoke a somatic ideal state that people should have. No, it's just we are looking at a mechanism, and if you compress the mechanism, of course, certain movements are impaired. Certain movement cannot happen. For example, if you look at the breathing movements are dependent on the movements of the different parts of the torso. If you compress the system, it will be very difficult to expand the torso appropriately. So the reeducation Alexander is talking about as a need of orders, or verbal orders that you give yourself. You must learn to change the system of guidance, and the orders are the tool. The orders are fundamental to the initial Alexander technique. Is this capacity we have to reason about a mechanism and to decide which movements we want to see and which movements we don't want to see. Because if you reason, if you come back to the picture of the teacher that was the touch teacher that was arching the back, well, the means whereby of her end, of her way of using the torso, are not exactly obvious, but you can reason them very easily. You must understand that that person must have given consent to at least 3 or 4 movements with the different parts of the torso to obtain that shape. So reeducation means that she needs to learn to concert instructions. We are not used to that in our education. In our education, we are in fact all trained to work sequentially. You do one thing well, and then you pass on to the next thing. It's that there is a progression that is imagined that should be the teaching progression. Alexander is in fact ruining this reasoning. He says, no. If you try to do one thing best, the other activities that are going on at the same time are all going to suffer from it. And they are going to, in fact, impose a habit that is exactly contrary to the one you want to obtain in the end. So having the end in mind is certainly not a solution to obtain it in the end. It is very clear about it that you need to learn to place your mind on different co-occurring events, and very slowly start to control whether you're gaining conscious control or not on the system you're referring to. That's this idea of coordination. So he says, what is obtained in reeducation, coordination and readjustment. Remember that this is supposed to be the proposal of the Alexander technique. So you should be trained in reeducation, in coordination. So you have to coordinate first ideas. You have to have ideas, intentions in your mind, so that in practice, you can then, perform the 3, 4, 6, 12 intention you had in mind to start with. And then you will control. So control happens with the same orders. the orders you wanted to perform, these intentions of movement, well, when you look at yourself on video, you want to see whether your movements, what we call readjustment, I will talk about it in a minute, whether the movements are clearly subordinated to the orders, are clearly going in the same direction as what you expected your intention to produce. So the readjustment is very, very near the end. It's very near what you would say is the gesture or the posture. It's the readjustment of the parts all together by the appropriate coordinated movements. So you get up a widening, more normal expanded position of the back and the spine. And the last blow for me in this sentence was that the fact that Alexander, he said that if the condition of the back be first secured, the neck and arms will no longer be stiffened and the other faults will be eradicated. In this, the neck is a consequence. So this will open a new discussion that I will have maybe next time about what are the primary and secondary orders? It's a question that is fundamental in the Alexander technique, but for the moment it's a bit too technical. I want to go through the basic understanding of orders of movements before we go into discussing orders of the orders of that are of inhibition, like neck free, head forward and up, back to lengthen and widen. That should never be performed, Dixit Alexander. And the new orders, which are, well, not indicated most of the time in Alexander's books. It's difficult to find just but hints of the new orders. For the last 20 years, I have spent every hour of my working life to define these orders. So we are going to discuss them. Alexander, in his third book, is making a statement after a few experiments where he finds that he's trying to change the end, and you would say the posture, or to change the gesture he's making, and he's failing. He's trying and failing. So he says, I now saw that if I was ever to succeed in making the change in use I desired, I must subject the processes directing my use to a new experience. The experience, that is, of being dominated by reasoning instead of by feeling, particularly at the critical moment when the giving of directions merged into doing for the gaining of the end I had decided upon. So you are trying to change a habit. You don't even notice that you are producing movements that are creating a wrong position, a wrong end. By the way, the picture I showed you in the beginning is the picture of a teacher that is in fact presenting her work on the internet to gain pupils. So if she does present that image, it must be that she doesn't observe the end in the way Alexander was observing the end. Alexander was observing the end with what he called a visual observation. Apparently, that person is not using the same process, because if she was, she would not choose that picture to present her work, because in the Alexander technique system, we think that if you do put your hands on people, you should command the expansion of your torso, and you should make sure that your neck is free. And Alexander says that for the neck to be free, the torso has to be correctly expanded. So if you present a picture with an upper torso backward, part of pigeon style, an abdomen that is protruding, well, it's because you have not made the same observation. I think that that person must evaluate her posture according to what she feels when she's doing it. When she's working in this way, she's really not concerned with the directions of the movement of the torso. It's a simple habit, simple subconscious somatic habit. A somatic embodied cognition has taken over, and her experience is dominated by feeling. That's how Alexander would present it. So he was in the same position. We all start in the same thing. There is no problem with that. Everybody has to start somewhere. So we start. We are dominated by feeling, and every single movement we do, we don't realize that these are coordinated movements that are interrelated. I will explain later what it is. And so Alexander makes this realization, and this is the start of the conscious guidance and control system of pedagogy. He says at he's already giving direction. What he says, I'm at the critical moment when the giving of direction merge into doing. The giving in of directions are the orders, giving of orders. And these, for me, these orders are orders or directions of movement. You can direct a movement. Well, you can imagine that you direct energy, but this is a way of talking. Human beings do not direct energy. They direct movements. You can control movements. You cannot control energy. Well, if you can, well, you don't need these lessons. Clearly, you know, superhumans maybe exist somewhere. I've never met them, and of course, I never met them because they don't need any lessons. Because if you direct energy, well, it's another level, you know. So we are reasonable people, and how do you define somebody that is reasonable? It's just a person that is dominated by reasoning instead of by feeling. That's simple. And so how do you know if you are dominated by reasoning at a moment of lifting the hands? You know if you have followed instructions, if your actions are subordinated to verbal instructions that were defined in advance. That's the system. Very simple. Yes, if you can tell, I am going to have the upper torso move forward and the lower torso move forward while the middle torso is going to move back at the same time, lengthening the structure and produce the end, well, visual observation will confirm that you have been dominated by reasoning instead of by feeling. You are not dominated in the sense of a peasant, for example, dominated by a lord. No. It's not the same thing. Dominated means here not something that you should fear, not something that is against nature. No, it's a human nature to find intelligent solution. Being dominated by reasoning is intelligence in action. That's the definition. So to prove the point still more, Alexander adds, a comment at the end of that sentence. He says, this idea of finding ways to make sure that he was following instructions and not following his feelings. He says, this meant that I must be prepared to carry on with any procedure I reasoned out as best for my purpose, even though that procedure might feel wrong. In other words, my trust in my reasoning processes to bring me safely to my end must be a genuine trust. not a half trust needing the assurance of feeling well or feeling right as well. And that is central to the way I teach the initial Alexander technique, is that there is this idea of procedure, way to proceed. That's how I translate it in my French mind. Way to proceed in order to gain an end. We are talking about a posture. Simply, the posture is the end. So when I film, I want to see which movements are occurring, which are producing the end. And the orders, in my view, are simply verbal instruction that will help me decide, make decisions, and create intentions of movements, and also organize the intentions of movement together. There is not only this business of repeating, I want the upper torso to go forward, I want the middle torso to go back. No, there must be also meta instructions that are in fact talking about how to get these instructions all together. There must be, you must understand, there must be instructions of performance, of course, what I want, but there must be instruction also of inhibition. That's fundamental to say, I don't want to perform the torso forward only, because if I do so, I am very, very certain, because I've seen it time and time again on screen when I was performing movement, that if I move the upper torso forward with this sole intention, just to feel how it was, how it could be, then the middle torso is going to go forward with it. And if the middle torso is going forward with the upper torso, which is the habit, well, this is not going to change the end, the geometry, the resulting geometry of the different movements. I will still be arched forward with the middle torso further forward than the upper torso. If the idea is readjustment, you have to produce a change. Alexander is pointing to the fact that that change is not going to feel right to you, because your concept of rightness is based on the old system of guidance. The concept of rightness is based on the old system, that is the feeling sense. If all your life you have not used the spring system of the back, well, the first time you start to, in fact, wound up that spring so that it can work for you, you're going to feel absolutely wrong. You're not going to feel that you are standing vertical. You have the impression that you're standing, for example, too far forward, yes, or too far back, doesn't matter, but it's not going to feel right. And so what is happening here is a very simple mechanism that we are all equipped with, which is called the orienting reaction, is that the mind of the baby is very selective, but very selective in a sort of fixed way. The baby is orientated toward what is new, what is different. If you produce a stimulation to the baby, anything in his field of vision, if he has never seen it before, you will find that somehow his brain will decide for him and have him stop what he's doing right now, and well, the experience, the intellectual experience, small extent intellectual experience that is going with it, that has to deal with feelings most of the time, will stop. And the baby, it's called orienting reaction, because the baby will orientate the external receptors, the eyes and the ears, toward the new stimulation. You have captivated the attention of the child. The child attention is not that easily activated, because if you present the same stimulus to the child, there is every chance that the child is not going to react. You have to produce a new one, another one. You think, okay, and you make another one. And you have to change the way you speak at the same time so that it creates a stimulation that is notably different. And if it's notably different, the child will react to it. There is a bit of a childiness. It's absolutely clear that when something new appears, everybody tends to turn around. For example, there was this a race horses competition with a fabulous prize in silver, I think. And Alexander explained that at one moment everybody was watching the prize, and of course there were policemen present to protect the prize. And the next moment, something like a battle erupted somewhere. Something very new happened. Everybody's attention was captivated, during which time the robbers took the prize away. And so that is an orienting reaction. And we are like in a race horses competition all the time, where our attention has a tendency to be captivated by new stimuli. So if you perform a new series of orders, you are creating a new stimulation, and you're bound to fall for it, instead of continuing to carry on with the procedure of projecting these very orders in the procedure, in the very neat way you wanted to proceed. You will find that somehow you got lost. You got attracted to one thing, and you started to concentrate on it, because with the orienting reaction, there is what we call a depolarization of the brain. The system of attention is suddenly stopping. Everything stops, and a new, very voluntary, intense concentration or focus on the new stimuli, so that the brain can categorize it, is going on. So it means that instead of continuing with this idea of being dominated by reasoning, by a series of intentions going on all at the same time, all together, says Alexander, you will find that you're suddenly focusing on something that has only one. It's simple, it's fascinating, exactly like when you go for a somatic lesson and you're suddenly fascinated by the new thing. So Alexander is pointing to the fact that we need to learn to direct not the movements, but the mind. We need to become capable of resistance against this automatic focus on new things. We need to be able to continue with the work, even if the work is not really new, exciting, amusing, nice. No, he says, feeling wrong. You are going to feel wrong. He says the procedure might feel wrong. The procedure will feel wrong. Is better. So now, what the position of the teacher in this is that the teacher is going to give orders to the person. So it was necessary for me to understand that the person is not necessarily the other that doesn't know. The teacher is, in the case of Alexander, for example, the teacher of himself. He taught himself his technique. So he didn't start by giving orders to others. He started by giving orders to himself. And in the end, any person learning the Alexander technique will come back to this idea of giving orders to herself. Not giving orders to others to give lessons is just an occupation in life. But you could, in fact, decide to learn the Alexander technique without giving lesson to others. You could just concentrate and give orders, conscious orders to yourself. So, of course, the definition or the nature of the orders is fundamental. And Alexander is making a great presentation of these orders. The only problem is that for some reason I cannot understand and explain, it took the explanation off the second edition of the first book. So the text I'm going to explain or to discuss now is present in the first edition of the Man Supreme Inheritance, 1910, but sorry, no. It's present in even before that, in 1908, in the Reeducation of the Kinesthetic System leaflet. So it's present in 1908. This chapter is reproduced in the 1910 edition, which we consider is, most people will say, this is the first edition of the Man's Supreme Inheritance book. And in the 1917 edition, this comment disappears for some reason. I really cannot understand why it disappears. It was so fundamental to me, to my understanding of how to give myself orders, that I cannot explain. So let's see what Alexander is saying about these orders. So the orders to be dictated by the teacher and mentally rehearsed by the pupil are of two kinds. A, orders concerning definite inhibition, and B, orders concerning definite performance. So suddenly we see this idea that there are things you want definite performance. You are going to perform a series of movements in order to obtain an end. So we are clearly in this idea of means whereby orders or means whereby direction, yes. And so these means whereby directions, verbal orders that you give yourself are of two kinds, concerning definite inhibition and definite performance. Alexander does not need to explain definite performance. You have to define the movements and then the person will try and perform them. But he's making an effort with the A, the orders concerning definite inhibition. He's saying, I may briefly explain these orders of definite inhibition by stating that the teacher will have to deal with incorrect movements unconsciously performed, of course, by the pupil. These movements, occurring at the moment when he dictates the orders necessary to bring about coordination of the different parts of the mechanism, assert themselves and become primary and hinder the performance of the correct and coordinated movements as ordered. Why was this part so important to my understanding of how I could be dominated by reason instead of by feeling at the moment of merging the orders into action? Well, the first thing was confirmation, because he says that this involuntary movement that the person is performing at the moment where she wants to project the movement of correct performance, yes, they become primary and they hinder the performance of the correct and coordinated movements as ordered. The last part of the sentence sounds like not much, but for me it was massive. The performance of the correct and coordinated movement as ordered. So you are clearly told here that the orders, the correct orders, are correct orders of coordinated movements. They are not orders of sending energy to the system, orders of like what sort of feeling could I order? No. Alexander is clearly saying that you have to order movements. And so in the next episode, we are going to start to discuss what is the sending of correct and coordinated movements? How can we represent movements? How can we define the criteria or characteristics that can be mentally understood? And this is the the next stage. For the moment, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's the idea that orders are something, well, that we can reason about. It's something that you don't need to be an expert, somatic person with an extraordinary sensory system attuned to extraordinary things. No, you can see if whether a person is lifting the hands, what sort of movement she's making when lifting the hands, and what is the end. Well, how is the person looking like? What is the posture looking like? And there is a clear idea that, of course, we are not that much interested in postures because posture are ends. We are interested in means whereby these ends can be produced at will and intelligently.
Excellent.
So, Kevin,
well, that's a good place to stop this week.
Yeah.
And next week we'll continue talking about orders. So for everyone watching the video, you'll find links to Jeando's websites underneath if you want to book a lesson with him. And we will see you again in the next video. Thank you, Jeando.
Thank you, Kevin.
Bye-bye.